Imagine for a moment that you are standing in Jerusalem very early in the morning. The sun has just begun to rise above the ancient stone walls of the city, and the temple courts are slowly filling with people. Pilgrims arrive from different regions. Some come with questions, others with hope, and many with curiosity. Because in those days, there was a man teaching in the temple who spoke in a way that people had never heard before. His name was Jesus. When he spoke, crowds gathered. Some believed him, others doubted him, and a few were already searching for a way to trap him. On that particular morning, Jesus was sitting in the temple courts teaching, but suddenly, something interrupts the calm atmosphere of the place. A group of religious leaders pushes through the crowd. Their movements are determined, their faces are serious, and between them, they drag a woman. She is forced into the center of the gathering where everyone can see her. Immediately, the atmosphere changes. People begin whispering. The woman looks down, avoiding every gaze. Her breathing is heavy, and it is clear that something serious has just happened. One of the Pharisees steps forward. "Teacher," he says, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery." The words echo through the courtyard. In that culture, according to the law of Moses, this was a very serious offense. The punishment was severe, death by stoning. But if she was truly caught in the act, where is the man? Only she stands there in the center of the crowd. Only she is exposed. The religious leaders continue speaking. "In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" Now the trap is clear. If he says she should not be stoned, they can accuse him of rejecting the law. But if he says she should, his reputation for mercy will collapse. Jesus does not answer immediately. He does not begin a debate. Instead, he bends down toward the ground and begins to write in the dust. Imagine that moment. The crowd falls silent. The Pharisees wait impatiently, and Jesus writes on the ground with his finger. The text never tells us what he wrote. Some believe he wrote the hidden sins of the accusers. Others think he wrote verses from the law. They push him again. "What do you say?" Slowly, Jesus stands up. He looks at them, perhaps moving across the faces of each man. Then he speaks a sentence that would echo through history. "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Suddenly, the focus shifts. The question is no longer about the woman's guilt. Now, the question is about the hearts of the accusers. Jesus bends down again and continues writing. One by one, the accusers start leaving. First the older men, then the younger ones. Slowly, stones begin to fall from hands to the ground. The sound is quiet but powerful. Each stone represents an admission. One by one, they turn away. The crowd begins to thin. Soon, there is only silence. And in the middle of that silence remain only two people. Jesus stands and looks at her, not as an object of accusation, but as a human being. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She realizes that the men who brought her there are gone, and she answers softly, "No one, Lord." And then Jesus speaks words that have moved hearts for centuries. "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and sin no more." If you had been there, standing in that circle, holding a stone in your hand, what would you have done? And it is exactly at that moment that the scene begins to reveal something even deeper. Because if we slow down and truly observe what just happened, we realize that this story is not only about a woman accused, it is also about the people around her, about the hearts of those who were ready to judge, about the silence that suddenly forced everyone to look inward instead of outward. The dust of the temple courtyard still lies on the ground. The lines Jesus drew with his finger may still be visible. No one approaches to read them. No one dares to ask him what he wrote. And yet, whatever those words were, they had an incredible effect. Because the men who had arrived with such certainty began to leave. Slowly, quietly, one after another. First, the older men. That detail alone has fascinated many readers. Why the older ones first? Perhaps because they had lived longer. Perhaps because they carried more memories within them. More moments they were not proud of. More situations in which they themselves had needed mercy instead of judgment. When a person lives long enough, they eventually realize something about human nature. No life is completely clean. No story is completely perfect. And maybe the older men recognize this truth faster than the others. Because his words did something unusual. They shifted the focus away from the woman and placed it directly on the hearts of the accusers. Imagine the men standing there holding stones. Just moments earlier, they had been confident. They had quoted the law, but now, the question is no longer about what the law says. Now, the question is personal. Who among them is truly without sin? Who can honestly say that their own life has never contained hypocrisy, failure, or secret wrongdoing? That question hangs in the air like a weight. And suddenly, the stone in each man's hand feels heavier than before. Perhaps he realizes that if the standard for throwing the first stone is absolute moral perfection, then he cannot do it. Slowly, he opens his hand. The stone falls. The sound is small, but in that moment, it feels louder than any speech. Another man watches him leave. Perhaps he begins to think about his own life, about the private moments no one else has seen. And so he too drops his stone. One by one, they follow the same path. It becomes a silent procession of conscience. The circle that had formed around the woman slowly dissolves. What once looked like a courtroom becomes an empty space. And at the center of it all stands the woman. Just a few minutes earlier, she was the focus of public shame. Now, the men who accused her are gone. Imagine the emotions moving through her mind. Fear may still be present. Shock. Confusion. Because a person who expects death rarely prepares themselves for mercy. And yet, that is exactly what has happened. Jesus stands there quietly. When he asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" The question feels almost unreal. When she answers, "No one, Lord," those words mark the end of the accusation. The verdict has dissolved. And then Jesus says something that continues to echo through history. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He does not pretend that the action was meaningless. Instead, he opens a path forward, a future not chained to the past. Jesus looks at the person beyond the failure. He sees the possibility of change. And that becomes the turning point. Her name is never mentioned. One possible explanation is that her anonymity allows the story to become universal. She becomes a mirror, a reflection of human weakness and human hope. That is why the sentence Jesus spoke still challenges readers today. Let the one without sin throw the first stone. Would we have had the courage to let it fall, or would we have remained frozen while the silence around us grew heavier? And that is the moment when the story begins to unfold even more deeply. What happened in that courtyard was not only a moment of mercy, it was also a moment that exposed something about every person who was standing there. The crowd was not silent only because of surprise. They were silent because something inside them had been confronted. The question Jesus asked did not remain outside of them. It entered their thoughts. It forced them to examine something they rarely considered in public settings: their own hearts. Imagine the men who had arrived with such confidence only a few minutes earlier. They had spoken with authority. They had quoted the law. In their minds, the situation seemed simple. A woman had committed a sin. The law had a punishment. The conclusion should have been obvious. But Jesus changed the direction of the entire moment with one sentence. Instead of discussing legal interpretation, he asked a question of moral integrity. And that kind of question cannot be answered quickly. It requires honesty. It requires reflection. And that reflection may have been uncomfortable for many, because when a person begins to examine their own life honestly, they often remember things they would rather forget. Moments of weakness or hypocrisy. Perhaps they realize that if the standard for throwing the first stone was absolute moral perfection, then none of them truly qualified. And so they walked away, slowly, quietly, without defending themselves, without arguing with Jesus. That silence itself is remarkable. Normally, religious debates in that time could become very loud. Yet here we see no debate, no protest, only the quiet sound of stones touching the ground and footsteps moving away. That silence tells us that the men understood what Jesus meant. Meanwhile, the woman remains standing where they placed her. The crowd around her has changed. The danger that surrounded her has disappeared. Yet she may still feel the echo of fear. When a person believes they are about to die, the body does not forget immediately. The men who dragged her there are gone. The stones lie scattered, and the teacher who changed everything stands in front of her calmly. When Jesus speaks to her, his words are not harsh. They begin with a question that acknowledges her reality. Where are your accusers? Where are the people who claimed the authority to judge you? Where are the voices that demanded punishment only moments ago? The accusation has collapsed. The court has dissolved. The judgment has vanished before it could be carried out. And then come the words remembered for centuries. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. These words hold an extraordinary balance. Many focus only on the mercy, and indeed, the mercy is undeniable. But the sentence also contains a direction for the future. Sin no more. This reveals how Jesus approached human failure. He did not pretend the failure never happened, but he refused to allow that failure to define the rest of a person's life. Instead, he opened the possibility of transformation. Forgiveness that invites change creates a completely new direction. What happened to that woman after she walked away? The biblical text never answers. Her story seems to disappear as suddenly as it appeared. Maybe the woman's future remained unknown so that each reader could focus not on her biography, but on the meaning of the moment. And that meaning continues to provoke reflection even now. The temptation to judge others has never disappeared from human society. In fact, it has become easier than ever. People form opinions quickly and pass judgment based on partial information. But the sentence spoken by Jesus interrupts that pattern. Let the one without sin throw the first stone. It does not say that justice is irrelevant. Instead, it asks a deeper question about the condition of the person who wishes to judge. Are you truly in a position to do so? Have you examined your own life with the same intensity you apply to others? Those questions require humility and honesty. They require the recognition that every human life contains imperfection. The story does not present an easy answer. Instead, it presents a mirror. When people look into it, they recognize something of themselves. Some may see the woman, remembering moments of shame. Others may see the crowd, recognizing how quickly judgment can form. But then, the voice of Jesus enters the scene again. If the stone had been resting in your hand, what would you have done next? Would you have held it tightly? Or would you have felt the weight of your own past pressing quietly against your conscience? Until your fingers slowly opened, allowing the stone to fall, while the silence revealed something about your own heart. A heart that you had never fully faced before. And it is precisely at this point that the story reveals one of its deepest meanings. Because the moment in the temple courtyard was not only about a woman who escaped a violent death, it was also about a revelation that reached every person who witnessed it. The stones that remained on the ground were more than just abandoned objects. They became silent symbols of a decision that each man had to make within himself. Only minutes earlier, those stones represented judgment. They represented certainty. They represented the confidence that comes when people believe they are defending what is right. But after hearing the words of Jesus, the meaning of those stones changed. Suddenly, they felt heavier, not because the stones themselves had changed, but because the men holding them had been forced to confront something within their own hearts. When Jesus said, "Let the one who is without sin throw the first stone," he did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply stated a condition that exposed the truth about every human life. And that truth was impossible to ignore, because no one standing there could honestly claim to be completely free from wrongdoing. The law they quoted was real. The sin they accused the woman of was serious. Yet the moment Jesus connected judgment with personal moral purity, the entire atmosphere shifted. Judgment suddenly required something none of them possessed: perfection. And perfection is something human beings have never been able to claim honestly. This realization moved through the crowd like a quiet wave. Perhaps some people looked down at the stones in their hands. Perhaps others stared at the ground, avoiding the eyes of the people around them. Because once the question of personal integrity enters a situation, public confidence often begins to collapse. One by one, the men stepped away. No speeches, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet recognition that the role they intended to play could no longer be justified. And when the last accuser disappeared into the crowd, the entire scene transformed. What began as a public trial ended in a private moment of reflection. The woman remained standing there, possibly still trying to process what had just happened. The same ground where stones had nearly become instruments of death now held nothing but silence. And in that silence stood Jesus, the only person in that entire courtyard who could genuinely claim to be without sin. If the condition he had spoken were applied literally, he alone would have been qualified to throw the first stone. Yet he did not move toward the stones. He did not call for the punishment to continue. Instead, he turned to the woman and spoke words that revealed a completely different approach to human failure. "Neither do I condemn you." That sentence alone carries an incredible weight, because it shows that authority does not have to express itself through destruction. It shows that truth does not always require immediate punishment. But the next part of his words is equally important. "Go and sin no more." Those final words introduce responsibility. They remind the woman that mercy is not permission to continue the same path. Mercy is an opportunity to choose a new one. In that moment, two realities exist side by side. The past cannot be erased. What happened did happen, but the future remains open. And that openness creates a possibility that the crowd had completely ignored: transformation. Perhaps that is the greatest difference between the perspective of the accusers and the perspective of Jesus. The accusers saw only the failure. They saw only the violation of the law. Their solution was simple: eliminate the offender. But Jesus looked at the same situation and saw something else. He saw a person capable of change. And that perspective altered the entire outcome of the moment. Instead of ending with death, the story ended with a new beginning. Yet the narrative leaves something unresolved. We never learn what became of the woman afterward. Did she return home quietly, overwhelmed by what had just occurred? Did she tell others about the teacher who refused to condemn her? The silence of the text leaves those questions unanswered. And perhaps that silence is intentional, because the focus of the story is not on the future biography of the woman. The focus is on the moment of decision, a moment when judgment was expected but mercy appeared instead. And that moment continues to challenge people long after the dust settled, because the question raised that day did not disappear with the crowd. It remained. It followed those who heard it. It echoed in their thoughts as they walked through the streets of Jerusalem. And it continues to echo in the minds of people today. How easily do we judge others? How quickly do we assume we understand the full story of someone else's life? How often do we believe that our own moral position is strong enough to justify condemning another person? The sentence spoken by Jesus interrupts those assumptions. It forces a pause. It forces reflection. Because before anyone throws a stone, they must ask a difficult question. What about my own life? What about my own hidden failures? What about the moments when I needed forgiveness instead of judgment? Those questions do not belong only to the ancient world. They belong to every generation. And perhaps that is why the story remains so powerful after 2,000 years. It is not simply an ancient religious account. It is a confrontation with the human tendency to judge. It is a reminder that every person stands somewhere between failure and mercy. And maybe that is the reason the woman in the story has no name. Because in a sense, she represents everyone who has ever hoped for mercy. She represents anyone who has ever stood in a moment of vulnerability, wondering whether the crowd would choose condemnation or compassion. And the men who dropped their stones represent another side of human experience. The moment when conscience interrupts certainty. The moment when a person realizes that judging another may reveal more about their own heart than about the accused. So the scene remains suspended in time. The stones still lie on the ground. The dust still carries the faint memory of words. And the question spoken in that courtyard continues to travel through history. If you had been standing there, if the weight of the stone rested in your hand while the teacher's words echoed in the silence, would you have been able to throw it? While a quiet realization began to grow inside you, that every human life survives not because it is perfect, but because mercy was allowed to speak.